Hello, everybody. I'm not sure if I've this correct. Okay, I need to turn it this way. Hi, it's Jeanette Finicum. It's day 4 of the Astarita trial, and I'm trying to give an update here on YouTube as well as on my Facebook page, so you can try to find us in either location. It was a very another long day of listening to FBI and Oregon State Police officers testify. We first heard from Officer BM, and then we heard from Officer John Nider. And BM and John Nider were both FBI agents, members of the HURT team. Then we heard from Officer 2 from Oregon State Police, one of the officers that shot and killed my husband. And then we heard briefly from Officer number 1, who also is an Oregon State Police officer who also shot at my husband, those fatal shots. He, however, was only on the stand for a few minutes and will return on Monday. We learned some things again today. I continue to hear the same narrative from both the prosecution and the defense in reference to all of the men and women there that were participating in the demonstration and standing up for property rights, but they were being described in court by the prosecution and the defense as armed and dangerous. That narrative played over, it just seemed to me like some of the questions were leading questions. They would describe my husband as armed and dangerous. Did you know he was dangerous? Did you know he was armed? Yes, I believe that the threat assessments that were turned over to the FBI were probably the same threat assessments they used in the Bunkerville Bundy incident that were created by Dan Love and those officials. We heard that through other testimony throughout the trial process for the other participants in the demonstration up there for the Hammonds. And so if that is the case, then those threat assessments had been altered and falsified and exaggerated to make these men seem that they were a huge threat. The narrative of my husband being a militia leader continued throughout today as well. I don't know why they have to continue with that, because he didn't belong to a militia. He was not a leader. He was a spokesman because he was articulate, and so they did put them in charge of some of the media contacts and such. There was also testimony that was repeated through each officer when they were asked by the FBI prosecution. They were asked if they heard any sounds as the truck was approaching them, and of course each officer then testified that they heard my husband accelerate. And I find that very curious as well, because when you are watching the video that they're showing you, you clearly can see my husband's brake lights. You can see the brake lights come on as he notices a roadblock after he goes around that blind curve, because it truly is a blind curve. If you've ever been on that stretch of road, which I have, and you drive it, there's a point you see nothing, and then there's a point that you see, oh my goodness, there's a roadblock, and he had, 12 seconds to respond. I don't believe he accelerated. His brake light shows that he hit the brakes and continued to keep his foot on the brake. And then you see him veer off to the left, and then it was testified in court that when he veered off to the left, there was Officer Nider who leaped to the right in the way of my husband's truck. And he was so fortunate not to have been hit, because you can see at the very last second as he's leaping right, the officer, my husband sees it as he's going left and jerks even further left at the very last second to avoid hitting that officer. I know my husband. I know him. He would not harm anyone. Not anyone. I know it was his intent to avoid hurting anyone there. But of course, they want to continue to demonize him even further by stating that, he was out to hit that officer, that they were in fear for their lives because that officer could have been killed. And likely so, he could have been, had my husband not continued to react to keep him out of harm's way. It was he who leaped in front of my husband, not my husband trying to intentionally hit him. It was also testified to that 2 officers in particular saw a casing on the ground. Now let me set this up for you just for a second. It's the V formation of the roadblock. There's Officer BM, Officer 1 in this next to each other, and Officer Astarita in this section. Officer 1 takes off into the center because he's getting ready to shoot my husband. BM is next to Astarita, and the shots are fired. And later, after everything settles down in that little V format, it's like a circle within the V and the other truck behind them. The one officer testified to seeing 1 shell casing on the ground. And as John Nider is moving from the position of where he almost gets ran over back behind one of the trucks, he too testifies to seeing a shell casing on the ground. But later it disappears. It disappears. I find that very curious. They go on to discuss, did you see that? There is conversation between the officers of, was that a 308 or was that a 223? They're discussing, is that your round or is it our round? Yet when they went to go log it, it disappeared. I'm just reading some of my notes here. I found it interesting later on during the day when Nider was testifying that they talked about group interviews. I guess it was a few days later that the FBI agents were interviewed, maybe 5, I believe, is what he said. And with that said, the FBI decided that they weren't going to allow individual interviews, that they could only do a group interview. And that isn't even normal protocol. That isn't even a standard practice for them. And the reason being is because the officer testified to that group interviews causes problems. It allows each individual to hear each other's answers, and then the facts get confused. And so, or they're intimidated because maybe there is a cover-up going on and they don't want to testify in front of the officer that might have done something illegal. But that's what the FBI insisted upon, was a group interview. I also found it interesting when Officer 2 describes what a non-lethal round is. He says it is, quote, a momentary pain controller. A momentary pain controller, a lethal shot, a non-lethal shot. And I thought to myself, well, that could have been, because there's been some theory that, my husband was shot with some non-lethal rounds that would continue to bring his hands down, because his hands kept going back up after, a split second. His hands would go back up after he brought them down. And so a momentary pain controller, they could have done that, which resulted in the murder of my husband, because then these other officers took action and shot him 3 times in the back, even though his hands were still up in the air. Officer 1 was only on the stand for 30 minutes or so, and so he will resume on Monday with the rest of his testimony, which the prosecutor says will be quite lengthy. So I would imagine he'll take most of the morning, if not all of the morning of Monday. But what he did say was that the militia, early on, there were reports of the militia in town. And I believe he's speaking of Ammon and whoever was with Ammon in October and November and December prior to the demonstration up there for the Hammonds. And so the authorities up there got together and decided to have a big planning meeting, because they had been hearing, and there had been people in town following law enforcement and other people. I don't even know what they're talking about, because my husband didn't participate in any of that. He wasn't up in Oregon except for when he went up to do the demonstration there with the parade and such. But they decided to put a plan together in December prior to them taking the refuge. They not only enlisted the Forest Service and the BLM, but they also had, the FBI, the Oregon State Police, and the Special Hertz team were all involved in this planning session. They had also been told that Ammon was more than likely to go as far as stopping the Hammonds from turning themselves in. And I don't know anything about that either, and neither did my husband. But these are the types of, this is the type of information that the law enforcement was given in reference to Ammon and his group prior to them even coming in January. So already they were pretty amped up, hyped up. They were given a lot of false information, thought they were dealing with very deadly men, and proceeded to act upon that. I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for following us, for caring about us, for continuing to support our family in this fight for justice to be seen through. This is just the FBI agent Astarita's trial in reference to him lying and obstructing justice. We are in the present still filing the wrongful death suit. It's been filed. I'm sorry, I don't mean to misspeak. It is filed. We are moving forward with that. We will continue with all the preliminary. I'll give you updates as I have them, but we are determined to see that through to the end as well. I want a jury of my peer to hear our side of the story and to not allow this to go forward. We should not, as a society, be okay with the fact that our police are shooting men in the back when their hands are in the air. I get that they need to protect themselves. I get that there's an element of risk. I get that they don't want to die either. But they need to wait until there is an actual threat that they can see. There were other options for them that day. He could have been tased. They could have used this momentary pain controller of non-lethal rounds. They could have done something else to subdue my husband, and he too would have been found not guilty, like Ammon and Ryan and Cliven were. And he too would be home with me right now had he been afforded his day in court. And so we will continue until we have justice. Thank you so much. God bless you.